The coffee shop near Coronado Naval Base was unremarkable vinyl booths, fluorescent lighting, the smell of burnt beans and diesel fuel from the highway. Lieutenant Commander Maya Reeves sat alone in the corner booth, her civilian clothes deliberate, her posture relaxed in the way only people with real training can manage. The khaki baseball cap shadowed her face. She'd been up for 36 hours, and the mission debrief wasn't until 1400. This was her only window of peace. She ordered black coffee and said nothing else. The waitress didn't look twice. Outside, 3 Marine corporals pushed through the door, loud with the kind of energy that comes from being young and convinced the world belongs to you. They wore their dress blues like armor, fresh from some ceremony, ribbons gleaming. One of them stocky, buzz-cut. The name tape read. Morrison scanned the room with the territorial sweep of someone marking his domain. His eyes landed on Maya. He nudged his buddy, grinned. They took the booth directly behind her. Maya heard every word. Morrison's voice carried like he wanted it to. He was talking about some joint op, how the Navy always screwed things up, how SEALs got all the glory but Marines did the real work. His buddies laughed on cue. Maya sipped her coffee. She'd heard it before, 20 minutes of this. Then Morrison stood, stretched, turned to leave. He wasn't watching where he walked. His elbow caught the edge of Maya's table. Her coffee tipped, spilled across the formica, splashed onto her lap. She didn't move. Morrison glanced down, saw the small woman in the cap and jeans, and his expression shifted into something between amusement and annoyance. He didn't apologize. Instead he said, "You should watch where you sit, ma'am. This is a military area. Civilians don't always get how things work around here." Maya looked up slowly. Her eyes were dark, calm, and entirely unreadable. She didn't stand. She didn't raise her voice. She just said, "You should watch where you walk, Corporal." Morrison's grin widened. He glanced back at his friends, playing to the audience. "Corporal, you know ranks, that's cute. You got a boyfriend on base or something." Maya set her cup down carefully. The waitress was already coming over with a towel, nervous. The other patrons had gone quiet. Morrison leaned one hand on the table, lowering himself to her eye level, condescension dripping from every syllable. "Do you know who I am?" Maya tilted her head slightly, as if considering the question with genuine curiosity. Her voice came out soft, almost conversational, but there was something underneath it, something cold and absolute. "Should I?" Morrison laughed. It was the kind of laugh that expected everyone else to join in. His buddies did dutifully. "I'm a Force Recon Marine, sweetheart. I've done things you couldn't imagine. I've jumped out of helicopters into hostile territory. I've called in airstrikes. I've saved lives." He straightened up, chest puffed. "So maybe show a little respect when you're sitting in our territory." Maya didn't blink. She reached into her pocket slowly, pulled out a black leather wallet and flipped it open on the table. The ID card faced Morrison. It took him 3 seconds to process what he was seeing: the rank insignia, the name, the designation underneath, Commanding Officer, Naval Special Warfare Development Group. His face went white. Morrison's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Maya picked up the wallet, slipped it back into her pocket, and stood. She was shorter than him by 4 inches, but somehow the geometry of the room had shifted. She wasn't looking up at him anymore. "You've called in airstrikes," she said quietly. "That's good. I've flown them." She stepped around him, moving toward the door. The waitress tried to wave away the coffee charge. Maya left a 20 on the counter anyway. Morrison was still frozen. One of his buddies whispered something harsh and urgent. Maya pushed open the door. The California sun was bright and merciless. Behind her she heard Morrison's voice, strained and desperate. "Ma'am, Commander, She didn't turn around. The door swung shut. The coffee shop stayed silent for a long time after that. Morrison stood in the middle of the aisle, his dress blues suddenly feeling like a costume. His buddies weren't laughing anymore. The waitress wiped down Maya's table slowly, and when she picked up the $20 bill, she saw something else underneath it. A single challenge coin, matte black, with a trident engraved on one side and a number on the other. Morrison never saw it. He was already walking out the door, trying to figure out how he'd explain this to his chain of command, because in a place like Coronado, stories travel faster than sound. And this one had just begun. The story of Maya Reeves didn't start at Coronado. It started in a place most people have never heard of, a small airstrip outside Yuma, Arizona, where the desert wind smells like creosote and aviation fuel. She was 17, skinny, too quiet for her own good, the kind of kid who got overlooked in every room she walked into. Her father had been a crop duster, her mother a nurse who worked nights. They didn't have much, but they had a Cessna 172 with a patched wing and an engine that coughed every third ignition. Her father taught her to fly before she had a driver's license. He never told her it was special. He just said, if you're going to do something, do it right. The sky doesn't care about excuses. She soloed at 16. No ceremony, no celebration. Just her and the wind and the sick feeling in her stomach as the wheels left the ground and she realized there was no one else in the plane. She landed 40 minutes later with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Her father nodded once and said, "Good, now do it again." She did. 100 times, 200. She learned to fly in crosswinds that would ground commercial pilots. She learned to read clouds like text. She learned that fear was just information and information could be managed. When she turned 18, the recruiter came through town, Navy Aviation. He had the polished shoes and the rehearsed speech. He talked about adventure and honor and the GI Bill. Maya listened, then asked one question. "What's the hardest thing you've got?" The recruiter blinked. "Excuse me, the hardest pipeline, the thing most people fail." He hesitated, then said, "Naval aviation, fighter pilots. But where do I sign?" She signed. Her father drove her to the MEPS station in Phoenix and didn't say anything the whole way. When she got out of the truck, he handed her a folded piece of paper. She opened it later at boot camp. It said, "You're stronger than you know. Prove it." She kept that paper in her locker through every phase of training, through the initial screening, through API at Pensacola, where the instructors assumed she was lost and pointed her toward the admin building, through primary flight training where she flew the T-6 Texan II and her instructor told her 3 weeks in, "You're too small. You're going to wash out." She didn't. She flew the T-45 Goshawk. She carrier qualified on the USS Theodore Roosevelt in seas that rolled the deck 12 degrees. She trapped at night in weather that grounded half the air wing. She didn't talk about it. She just did it. They gave her wings. They gave her orders to VAQ-129, the Electronic Warfare Training Squadron. She flew the EA-18G Growler, big, heavy, complex. She learned to jam enemy radar, to thread through surface-to-air missile envelopes, to turn herself into a ghost on the electromagnetic spectrum. Her call sign came during a training mission off the California coast. She was flying with a crew of hotshot males, all of them louder and more confident than she was. The mission was an opposed transit simulate breaking through an enemy IADS network. Her wingman got cocky, got locked up by the aggressor, got killed in the sim. Maya stayed quiet. She reconfigured her jamming pods mid-flight, shifted frequencies, fed deceptive data into the enemy's kill chain, and walked through the entire threat ring without a single lock. When they landed, her lead asked how she'd done it. She said, "I listened." They started calling her Whisper. It stuck. By the time she made lieutenant, Whisper was the pilot other pilots asked for. She deployed 3 times. She flew missions the Navy doesn't talk about in places the Navy doesn't acknowledge. She stayed calm when everyone else was screaming. She made decisions that saved lives and she never asked for credit. When DEVGRU came calling, the unit most people know as SEAL Team 6, they weren't looking for someone flashy. They were looking for someone surgical. Someone who could fly a helicopter into a situation with zero margin for error and bring everyone home. They reviewed her jacket. They watched her sim footage. They interviewed her for 6 hours. At the end, the co asked, "Why do you want this?" Maya thought about her father's note. She thought about the paper still folded in her gear bag. She said, "Because it's the hardest thing you've got." They selected her. She became one of the first women to fly direct action missions for DEVGRU. She flew MH-60 Black Hawks and MH-47 Chinooks into the kind of darkness that doesn't exist on maps. She inserted operators into compounds. She extracted them under fire. She flew so low over the ocean that the rotor wash turned the surface into mist. Her crew chiefs called her supernatural. She never missed a pickup. Morrison didn't know any of this. He couldn't. The missions were classified. The unit was compartmented. But the reputation traveled. In the small world of naval special warfare, Whisper was a legend, and Morrison had just spit coffee on her jeans. By the time Maya walked into the DEVGRU compound that afternoon, the story had already arrived. The sentries at the gate were grinning. The duty officer smirked when she signed in. She ignored them and headed straight for the operations center. The debrief was in progress. Her last mission, a HVT extraction in the Horn of Africa, surgical and fast. The SEAL team leader, a chief named Dalton, looked up when she entered. He didn't smile. He never did. He just nodded once and said, "Good work, Whisper. Your insertion was flawless." She took her seat. They reviewed the timeline, the intelligence package, the enemy response. Maya spoke only when asked, her answers precise and unemotional. When the brief ended, Dalton lingered. "Heard you had an interesting morning." Maya glanced at him. "Word travels. Word always travels, especially when it's funny." He paused. "You handle it." "I didn't have to." Dalton allowed himself the ghost of a smile. "Good, because Morrison's chain of command is currently tearing him a new one. Turns out disrespecting a DEVGRU commander in public is a bad career move." Maya didn't respond. She gathered her notes and stood. Dalton added, "You know, you could have embarrassed him more, dropped the clearance bomb, made it official." Maya looked at him evenly. "That would have been petty." "True," he tilted his head, "but satisfying." "Maybe." She headed for the door. "But I don't fly for satisfaction. I fly to bring people home. Morrison's got nothing to do with that." Dalton watched her leave. He'd flown missions with her for 2 years, and he still couldn't figure out what made her tick. She wasn't cold. She cared more than anyone he'd met, but she didn't need validation. She didn't need people to know who she was. She just needed to do the job right. That was rare. That was why she was here. That night, Morrison sat in the barracks, staring at his phone. His platoon sergeant had called him in earlier. The ass-chewing had been biblical. He'd been told, in precise and creative language, that he was lucky the commander hadn't filed a formal complaint, that his career had just dodged a bullet, that if he ever pulled that shit again, he'd be cleaning latrines in Djibouti for the rest of his enlistment. Morrison had apologized multiple times to multiple people. None of them had been Maya Reeves. His buddy, Lance Corporal Torres, sat on the bunk across from him. "Dude, you really didn't know?" Morrison shook his head. "How was I supposed to know?" She looked like what? Torres' voice was sharp. "Like someone who didn't belong." Morrison didn't answer. Torres leaned forward. "You know what I heard? I heard she flew the raid that pulled out that ambassador in Chad, the one nobody talks about. I heard she put a Chinook down on a roof in a sandstorm with SAMs lighting up the sky. I heard the crew chief said she didn't even breathe hard." Morrison felt his stomach twist. That's probably exaggerated." "Probably." Torres stood, grabbed his gear. "But you know what's not exaggerated? You calling her sweetheart in a coffee shop." He left. Morrison sat alone. The barracks were loud, someone blasting music, someone yelling about a video game. He barely heard it. He kept replaying the moment in his head. The way she'd looked at him, calm, unshaken, like he was a child throwing a tantrum. He'd spent his entire adult life building a reputation. Force recon, combat deployments, ribbons and quals. And in 30 seconds she'd made all of it feel meaningless. Not because she'd humiliated him, but because she hadn't needed to. He pulled out his phone. Found the DEVGRU website, or what little of it existed. Most of it was redacted, but there were names. Commanders, and there, buried under Naval Special Warfare Development Group leadership, was a single line. LCDR M. Reeves, Aviation Operations. No photo, no bio, just the name. Morrison stared at the screen. Then he opened a new message to his platoon sergeant. The text took him 15 minutes to write. In the end, it was simple. "I need to apologize to Commander Reeves." "How do I do that?" The response came back 3 minutes later. "You don't. You learn from it and move on. She's got better things to do than accept apologies from corporals who don't know when to shut up." Morrison read it twice. Then he deleted the message thread and lay back on his bunk. The ceiling tiles were water-stained and yellow. He stared at them until his eyes hurt. Somewhere on the other side of the base, Maya was in the air. The night flight was routine pattern work, instrument checks, making sure the MH-60 was responding correctly after the last maintenance cycle. Maya flew alone, the crew chief riding in back, silent. The cockpit was dark except for the green glow of the instruments. Outside, the ocean was a black void. No moon, no horizon, just the sound of the rotors and the faint hiss of the radio. She leveled at 1,000 feet and let her hands settle on the controls. This was where she felt most herself. Not on the ground, not in briefings, not in coffee shops where corporals tried to measure their worth in decibels. Here, in the dark, doing the thing she was built for, the crew chief's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ma'am, how'd that thing at the coffee shop go?" Maya smiled faintly. "You heard. Everybody heard. Scuttlebutt says you broke that Marine without saying a word." "I didn't break him, I just showed him an ID card." "That's breaking him." The crew chief chuckled. "You know there's a betting pool on whether he shows up to apologize." "He won't." "You sure?" "Yeah," Maya adjusted her heading. "Because if he's smart, he's already figured out that apologizing to me doesn't fix the problem. The problem isn't that he disrespected me. The problem is that he assumed I didn't belong, and he'll keep assuming that about other people until he fixes what's in his head. An apology doesn't do that." Silence on the intercom. Then, "Damn, ma'am, that's cold." "No. It's honest." She flew the pattern twice more, smooth, mechanical, flawless. When they landed, the crew chief secured the aircraft and Maya filled out the logbook. The night air smelled like salt and jet fuel. The base was quiet. She walked back to the ready room and on her desk was a single envelope. No name, no return address. She opened it. Inside was a handwritten note on Marine Corps letterhead. "Commander Reeves, I was out of line. I let my ego do the talking and disrespected someone who's done more in a day than I've done in my career. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know I'm sorry. Respectfully, CPL Morrison." Maya read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in her desk drawer. She didn't respond, not because she was angry, but because the note told her everything she needed to know. He'd learned. That was enough. 3 months later, Maya was in the operations center when the call came. The mission was urgent political hostage situation in East Africa, American contractor kidnapped by militia forces, 72 hours to locate and extract before the window closed. Intelligence was thin. The target building was in a dense urban area, surrounded by hostile forces. The SEAL platoon was already wheels up. They needed air. They needed someone who could thread the needle in a hot LZ with civilians nearby and enemy fighters entrenched. The co looked at Maya. "You up for this, Whisper?" She nodded. "What's the package?" "Single HVT male mid-40s, likely held in a compound in the city center. Streets are too narrow for a standard infill. You'll have to put them on the roof. Enemy air defense. Man-portable. RPGs, maybe a technical with a 50 cal. No radar." Maya ran the numbers in her head. Rooftop insertion meant zero margin for drift. The MH-60 would be exposed during the entire hover. If the enemy opened up, there was no cover, no room to maneuver, just speed and precision. "I'll take it," she said. The co briefed the platoon. The team leader was Dalton, the same chief who'd worked with her before. He trusted her implicitly. They ran through contingencies, abort criteria, emergency extract protocols. Maya listened, filed it all away, and then walked to the flight line. The MH-60 was already prepped. Her crew chief, a wiry petty officer named Kim, was running pre-flight checks. He looked up when she approached. "Heard this one's hairy, ma'am." "They all are." "Yeah, but this one's hairier than usual." She pulled on her helmet. "Then we'll be more careful than usual." They lifted off at 2300 hours. The Black Hawk cut through the darkness like a blade, running low and fast over the water. The coast appeared as a thin line of lights, then vanished as they crossed into hostile territory. Maya flew blacked out, using night vision and terrain masking to stay invisible. The city emerged slowly, concrete sprawl, narrow streets, buildings packed tight. The target compound was a 3-story structure with a flat roof, surrounded by alleys barely wide enough for a motorcycle. Intelligence had marked it with an IR beacon. She saw it pulsing on her display. 30 seconds, she said over the radio. Dalton's voice came back steady. "Roger, standing by." Maya brought the MH-60 into a hover over the rooftop. The downdraft kicked up dust and debris. She held the bird perfectly still, rotors inches from the adjacent walls. The SEALs fast-stroked down, shadows dropping into the dark. Kim called out the count. "All personnel on target, clear." Maya lifted slightly, moved the bird into an orbit pattern around the compound. Below, gunfire erupted. Muzzle flashes in the windows. Dalton's voice on the radio, calm but clipped. Contact. Multiple hostiles, moving to secure the HVT. Maya watched the infrared feed from the compound. The SEALs moved through the building like smoke, clearing rooms, more gunfire, a brief, brutal exchange. Then silence. Dalton's voice, HVT secured, requesting immediate extract. Maya didn't hesitate. She swung the Black Hawk back over the rooftop, descending through a hail of small arms fire that sparked off the fuselage. Rounds punched through the thin skin of the bird, but she didn't flinch. She held the hover rock steady. The SEALs emerged with the contractor, middle-aged, disoriented, barefoot. They pushed him up the fast rope, hauled him into the cabin. Dalton came last, firing controlled bursts back into the stairwell. "Last man aboard," Kim shouted. Maya pulled pitch and the Black Hawk leapt into the air. A rocket-propelled grenade screamed past the tail boom, missing by less than 10 feet. She banked hard, dropped the nose, and accelerated out of the city at maximum speed. The crew compartment was chaos: medics working on the contractor, SEALs reloading, Kim patching a bullet hole in the hydraulic line with duct tape and a prayer. Maya flew. She didn't look back. She threaded through the valleys, stayed below radar, and brought them to the extraction point 40 minutes later. When the wheels touched down, the contractor was stable. The SEALs were intact. The bird had taken 11 hits but was still flying. Dalton pulled off his helmet and looked at Maya. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "That was the best flying I've ever seen." Maya shut down the engines. "It's what I do." Dalton shook his head slowly. "No, it's what you are." She didn't respond. She climbed out of the cockpit, inspected the damage to the aircraft, and started filling out the after-action report. The contractor was being loaded onto a medevac. The SEALs were laughing, the post-mission adrenaline turning everything into dark humor. Maya sat on the ramp of the Black Hawk, her flight suit drenched with sweat, and watched the sun rise over the desert. Back at Coronado, the story spread. Not through official channels, it never did, but through the network of quiet conversations that exist in the special operations community. The pilots heard, the crew chiefs heard, the support staff heard, and eventually the rest of the Navy heard. Maya Reeves had flown a mission that should have been impossible and made it look routine. The command put her in for a medal. She declined the ceremony. They gave it to her anyway in a closed-door meeting with the CO and no one else present. She put the medal in a box with the others and went back to work. Morrison heard about it 3 weeks later. He was at a bar off base, sitting with some other Marines, when a Navy petty officer mentioned it in passing. "Yeah, that DVGRU pilot, Whisper. She pulled off some insane extract in Africa, flew through fire like it was nothing." Morrison's stomach dropped. He didn't say anything. He just finished his beer and left. He walked to his truck and sat in the parking lot, staring at the steering wheel. He thought about the coffee shop, about the way he'd assumed she was nobody, about how wrong he'd been. He thought about the note he'd written, the note she'd never responded to. He wondered if she'd even read it. He wondered if it mattered. The truth was settling into him now, heavy and undeniable. She was everything he'd wanted to be, and she'd done it without ever needing to tell anyone. She didn't need to prove herself. She just was, and he dismissed her because she didn't fit his narrow idea of what strength looked like. He started the truck and drove back to base. The next morning, he put in a request to transfer to a joint training program, something that would put him in the same orbit as the people he'd disrespected. Not to apologize again, but to learn, to see what real competence looked like up close. The request was approved. 6 months later, Morrison found himself at a desert training site, running mission simulations alongside DEVGRU personnel. He was one of 12 Marines selected for the exercise. He worked hard, kept his mouth shut, and tried to absorb everything. On the third day, a Black Hawk landed to insert a team. Morrison was standing near the LZ when the pilot climbed out. It was her, Whisper. She didn't look at him. She was focused on the crew chief, discussing rotor RPMs and fuel load. Morrison hesitated, then walked over. He kept his distance, didn't intrude, just waited. She finished her conversation and turned. Her eyes landed on him. She recognized him immediately. "Corporal Morrison," she said. Her voice was neutral. Morrison swallowed. Ma'am, I wanted to say. She held up a hand. You already said it in the note. He blinked. You read it. I read it. She adjusted her helmet. And you're here. That tells me more than the note did. Morrison didn't know what to say. She studied him for a moment, then said, You're doing the work. That's what matters. Keep doing the work. She walked past him toward the operations tent. Morrison stood there watching her go. He felt something shift inside him. Not absolution. He didn't deserve that, but maybe understanding. Maybe the beginning of becoming someone better. That night the training cadre gathered for a brief. Maya was leading the aviation portion. She stood at the front of the room, calm and precise, and walked through the insertion plan. Morrison listened. Really listened. She didn't speak like someone trying to impress anyone. She spoke like someone who knew her job so well that the words were just tools, nothing more. When the brief ended, one of the senior SEALs asked a question. Commander, what's the worst call you've ever had to make mid-flight? Maya paused. The room went quiet. She thought about it, then said, I was flying an extract in Syria. We had 2 casualties on board, both critical. The medevac was 30 minutes out. I had enough fuel to make it, but barely. Halfway there, I got a call. Another team was pinned down, taking fire, requesting immediate air support. If I diverted, I'd save the second team, but the 2 casualties on my bird wouldn't make it. The room was silent. What did you do? The SEAL asked. Maya's expression didn't change. I kept flying to the medevac. The 2 on my bird survived. The second team held out long enough for another asset to reach them, but I didn't know they would. I had to make the call based on probabilities and the mission priority. It was the right call tactically, but it still feels wrong. No one spoke. Morrison felt the weight of it, the burden of command, the responsibility of life-and-death decisions made in seconds. Maya continued. That's the job. You make the best call you can with the information you have, and then you live with it and you don't make excuses. She looked around the room. Any other questions? There were none. She nodded and stepped down. The brief ended. Morrison walked out into the desert night. The stars were sharp and cold. He thought about his career, his ribbons, the things he'd been proud of. They felt smaller now. Not meaningless, but smaller. He was beginning to understand what he'd missed. It wasn't about glory. It wasn't about being seen. It was about doing the thing that needed to be done, even when no one was watching, even when it cost you something. Over the next year, Maya's reputation grew despite her efforts to avoid it. DEVGRU operators requested her by name. Other pilots studied her techniques. She became the standard, but she didn't change. She flew the missions. She brought people home. She didn't do interviews. She didn't attend the galas. When the Navy Times tried to run a story on women in special operations, she declined to participate. There's no story, she told the reporter. I do my job, that's it. Porter pressed. But you're breaking barriers. You're showing what's possible. Maya looked at her evenly. I'm not breaking barriers, I'm just flying helicopters. The barriers were always imaginary. People just decided they were real. The story ran anyway, but without her interview. It featured quotes from the people she'd flown with. Dalton called her the best combat aviator I've ever worked with, regardless of gender. Kim, her crew chief, said, She's got hands like silk and nerves like steel. I'd fly into hell with her and not think twice. Morrison, now a sergeant and back with his Force Recon unit, saw the article. He cut it out and pinned it to the wall of his team room. When his junior Marines asked why, he said, because that's what competence looks like, and we should remember it. The months turned into years. Maya continued to fly. She deployed. She trained new pilots. She turned down a promotion that would have put her behind a desk. I'm a pilot, she told the co. I fly. That's what I'm good at. The co didn't push. He knew better. In her rare downtime, Maya went back to Arizona. Her father was older now, slower, but he still kept the Cessna running. They flew together sometimes, just the 2 of them, low over the desert. He never asked her about the missions. He didn't need to. He just said once, You did it right. She nodded. That was enough. One afternoon, Maya was sitting in the ready room when a young ensign approached her. The ensign was nervous, fresh from flight school, assigned to her squadron. She held a notebook and a pen. Ma'am, I wanted to ask, how do you handle the pressure, the fear? Maya looked at her. The ensign had the same look Maya remembered from her own reflection years ago, skinny, uncertain, trying to prove something. You don't handle it, Maya said. You just accept that it's there. Fear is information. It tells you what's at stake. Listen to it. Then do the job anyway. The ensign nodded slowly. Does it ever go away? No, the ensign looked deflated. Maya added, but you get better at living with it. And eventually you realize the fear isn't the enemy. The enemy is letting it stop you. The ensign left. Maya watched her go. She thought about the coffee shop, about Morrison, about all the people who'd underestimated her because she didn't fit their picture of strength. She didn't hold grudges, she just kept flying. The next mission came a week later. Another hostage situation, this time in the Philippines. The call came at 0300. Maya was in the air by 0430. The insertion went clean. The SEALs moved through the target like water. The extraction was under fire, but she held the bird steady, took the hits, and got everyone out. When they landed the hostage, a young aid worker was crying, holding onto one of the SEALs. Maya shut down the engines and climbed out. The aid worker looked at her. "Thank you," she said, voice shaking. "Thank you for getting me out." Maya nodded. "You're safe now, that's all that matters." The aid worker wiped her eyes. "Who are you?" Maya almost smiled. "Just a pilot." She walked away. The SEALs were already debriefing, running through the mission timeline. Maya joined them. Dalton caught her eye and gave her a small nod. They'd done another impossible thing. And tomorrow they'd do it again. That's how it worked. That's how it had always worked. Years later, Morrison was leading his own team. He'd made staff sergeant, earned his place. He was good at his job, respected, competent. He'd learned to listen more than he talked. He'd learned to see people for who they were, not who he assumed they were. One night during a joint op in the Middle East, he found himself on a base where DEVGRU was running operations. He saw a Black Hawk on the flight line, rotors tied down, fuselage scarred from 100 missions. The tail number was familiar. He walked over. The crew chief was doing post-flight checks. Morrison asked, "This Whispers bird?" The crew chief glanced up. "Yeah, she just landed 20 minutes ago." "Why?" Morrison shook his head. "No reason, just wanted to see it." The crew chief studied him, then said, "You know her?" "I met her once, long time ago." "She's a legend." Morrison nodded. "Yeah, she is." He stood there for a moment, then walked away. He didn't need to see her again. He didn't need to say anything else. The work had already been done. The lesson had already been learned. And somewhere in the dark, Maya was planning the next mission, her hands steady, her mind clear. She didn't think about Morrison. She didn't think about the coffee shop. She thought about the flight plan, the weather, the LZ. She thought about bringing people home. That's all she'd ever cared about. And that's all she'd ever need.